Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name's Dom Robinson, and welcome to SM Advanced Forum, or SMAF for short. It's easier to say. Your monthly podcast all about what's going on in the industry around and about streaming. As always, I'm joined by my erstwhile co-hosts, but I'm going to hand you first of all to Tim. Tim, are you out there?
Hey, Dom. Yep, I'm out here. And normally you see the shape of the world behind me, but it, as happened a couple months ago, I'm in a hotel. The irony is I couldn't get good connection in the hotel I was staying at, so I went across to the Hilton, and they said, sure, we'll give you connectivity. Come sit in the back office of the hotel. So if you get if I have random irate guests come through, you'll understand. But yeah, I'm here.
Excellent.
They didn't tell you have to wash dishes later, Tim.
Yeah, well, they didn't tell me what the price was for using the good connection. So you're right, Eric. I may end up sending some pictures of me working back there. Speaking of Eric, I'm going to segue over to Eric and ask him sort of what he's been doing, and then he'll hand off to Mark, back to Dom, and then come back to me.
Hey, thanks, Tim. Yeah, I am sitting here with the 5th snow day in 2 weeks, working from home. We've got some ice coming down here in Wisconsin. Been working on the streaming media source book and planning things for Streaming Media East. We've got Netflix, Hulu, and Cheddar keynoting, so that's pretty exciting. More news about that will be coming soon. And we've got Streaming Forum coming up in London, but I think we're going to talk more about that at the end of SMAF today.
Cool. And I think we got Mark out there somewhere too. Mark, how is it on the West Coast? Sunny, warm?
It's 72 and sunny, as always. It was a bit chilly last night, but yeah, no, things are good here. Just been working on a few events for Tidal Music as usual, and heads down on a few things for Marvel Entertainment at this point. But you know, business as usual here. Nothing.
Iron Man suit, have you?
Sorry, say again.
Been testing out the Iron Man suit, have you?
Yeah, exactly. The Mark 8, is it now? I'm not sure.
The Mark 8.
But yeah, right. Yeah, things are good.
Cool, excellent. Well, Tim, why don't you take us into our guests and find out who we've got joining us this month, and then find out some topics from them.
Absolutely. And I guess before that, Dom, let me just mention CES was the trade show, I think, that happened after we all were together last month. There's quite a bit that went on there. In fact, one of our guests has a topic we're going to talk about along those lines. I have to say, though, Mark, I know you said it's sunny and 72. I was in San Diego and LA just after CES, and the flooding from the rains that you all had out there was absolutely incredible. Not that it was a lot of rain, it was just LA and San Diego aren't designed to handle a lot of that runoff. So there's a whole lot of flooding that I didn't
expect.
Very
true. I think we had like 3.5 inches the other day, and I got a flash flood warning on my phone. It's a little ridiculous, but you know, we do what we can.
I think you got to talk about the British Rail. Leaves on the track and that. Anyway.
All right, so let's start first with Bea. Bea, introduce yourself. Tell us about your company and a little bit about your background in the industry.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Hi, everyone. I'm Bea Alonso. I work for Uyala. I run the product marketing group at Uyala. Before that, I've always had fairly technical roles. This going into product marketing is a bit of a new angle in my career, which is quite interesting because you just learn to see the industry from a slightly different angle. I had been in technical roles, either training folks to use technology with companies such as Avid or Grass Valley. So it's interesting because most of my background doesn't come from streaming. But at the end of the day, it's all converging. So it's a great time to be in the industry right now. It's all change. I am currently based out of Barcelona. The last 7 years, I was based out of Singapore. So I still have a fairly APAC angle in the way I see things today. And it's lovely temperature here. I'm going to say it in non-American is 14, 15 Celsius. So we kind of enjoying an early spring at the moment.
Well,
I want to mention, and I want to make sure that this is pretty obvious at the beginning of the program, representing the Women in Streaming Network group. So it's a great pleasure to be the representative for this month's podcast. For those who are not aware, this is a super fun group of women who work in the streaming industry. And we get together whenever we can in events around the world, and we always encourage more ladies to join us. One of the things we were chatting about just before the beginning was that this is a fun industry to work in, and I'm hoping to encourage more younger generations to join us in streaming as well.
And I want to add something to that. You mentioned you came out of Avid Grass Valley. I did consulting work to Media 100, Digit Design, and a number of companies in the early days. There were a few female executives in that part of the industry, not very many. And as they rose to the top, they tended to leave. And I remember having conversations with some of them asking if they'd consider staying in the industry. And they said there aren't a whole lot of mentors. So I'm ecstatic about the women in streaming, because that mentorship possibility, both from a high level, as you say, product management, product marketing, to the technical side and engineers, is something that we need to continue to encourage.
Completely agree. And I think we are seeing the beginning of that transition happen. And I've been thinking long and hard about why this is happening now. And, you know, this convergence of going from the pure broadcast hardware kind of side of things to a much more IT-based systems and very creative, very cool. You know, streaming is actually pretty cool and associated with amazing products. You know, if you were lucky to go to CES, you would have seen that the future of this industry, it's very promising. So I think that plays a part in why we are seeing more women working in technical roles and actually looking to lead technical teams too. We've got the World Mobile Congress happening here in Barcelona pretty soon, and we are doing an event with the Women in a Streaming Network. We're looking for speakers that are inspiring and can indeed inspire more women to take those leading roles.
Good. Well, as a matter of fact, I want to talk about Mobile World Congress a bit toward the end when we talk about Streaming Forum, because I'm hoping to actually attend both one day at Streaming Forum. And I normally do 2 days in Barcelona at Mobile World Congress. I get the technical inundation of all the phones, and then I go for 2 days to Montserrat and a hike. So just to get completely away from technology. So
what an excellent itinerary.
It certainly, I like it that direction as opposed to the other, because I get my technical overload and then I give 2 days to think when I have no access to a phone or anything like that. So,
brilliant.
All right, we're going to move on real quick here. Sorry,
real quick before we move on from the Women in Streaming group, wanted to mention NAB's coming up in 3 months, and Peggy Dow, who was one of our guests 2 or 3 months ago, reached out to me and let me know that there will be a Women in Streaming panel at NAB that they are putting together.
Oh, good.
And so more details on that to come, but it's good to see it getting out even more publicly and becoming part of the conversation. And I was honored to be invited to be on that panel as well and talk about what I see and what we're doing. So really looking forward to that.
And Eric, one thing I think you should mention too, before we go on to Ian, is sort of your shifting role within streaming media, because obviously we've got the what Troy's doing as well.
Yeah, we'll be talking a little bit more about that next month. We relaunched streamingmedia.com website earlier this week, in fact, in a much needed, much overdue revamp of the site design and the site functionality. And along with that, Troy Dreyer, my senior editor, will be taking over more of the day-to-day publishing of news articles, blog posts. We've reintroduced the Streaming Media blog. And so we're actively looking for writers at the moment, and people should get in touch with me or Troy about that if they're interested.
I feel like we need a round of applause at that point. Hold on a sec. That was worth it, wasn't it? On the other podcast, they let off a firework with announcements like that, but I'm not doing that.
Well, and Eric's got his plate full with all the shows now, because I mean, he did do streaming for him, but now he does Stream Media East, Stream Media West. We've still got the European magazine, the European site. So there's a whole lot of stuff, and it's good to see Troy being able to step up and help in some of that as well. Yeah,
and hopefully we'll get Troy on as a guest in one of these upcoming SMAF episodes too.
Okay, awesome. One other comment, both to Bea and yourself, Eric, when you talk about the broadcast world, NAB and like that, I was sitting in the press room at IBC in Amsterdam back in September, and there's a female group in the broadcast world as well called RAIN, R-A-I-N. I don't know much about them, but I happened to overhear the conversation. I introduced Dom to a few of the people there, and I think it's one of the things that Bea was talking about, where we've got this sort of integration or merging of traditional broadcast and IT/OTT. It'll be interesting to see if we as a streaming industry can help bridge the gap to the broadcast world, and specifically if women in streaming media can help bridge the gap to RAIN and other groups of much more traditional sort of hardcore engineering that comes out of broadcast.
Can I just double check? Do you mean RISE, perhaps?
Maybe it is RISE.
Yeah.
Right. All right.
So RISE is again a group for women in broadcast, and I'm quite an active member of RISE too. Okay. But in a way, I just think and I know the rationale for that group being created, because much more than in the streaming world, there is a huge gap where not a lot of women participate in technical broadcast roles. Okay. Okay. But I think with time, it would make a lot of sense for these two groups to work together, because at the end of the day, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this at some point today, that division between broadcast and streaming is just doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, one is an evolution of the other.
It doesn't make a lot of technical sense. I think what we've found is it makes, whether it's political or business sense, groups have tended to keep things in silos. So RISE, sorry, not RAIN. I absolutely agree. And it's interesting to know that you're part of both, because it just struck me that there was this group that was doing something that seemed similar, having had a number of guests on from women in streaming media, to understand that there were also efforts that have been ongoing in the more traditional broadcast space as well.
Yeah, and if I may, and just to round up this topic and move on perhaps, what we observed was an age difference. In the RISE group, there were ladies that were more in the 40 plus perhaps, whereas in the streaming group, we were seeing late 20s and early 30s a lot more. And I think this is also indicative of both industries, not just for women, but generally, newer generations are a lot more comfortable talking about streaming technology. That is something that comes a bit more natural. And perhaps the other way around too. My sort of older generation, we are more used to kind of understanding broadcast processes and technology, and perhaps that's what we were observing in the membership of each group. But
okay.
Yeah, anyway.
That's good to know. Well, and Eric, of course, got invited because he's about 27. That's why he's speaking on the panel. So, all right, moving on. Moving on. Ian, introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about your background in the world. I understand Dom said you and he have been somewhat either compatriots or comrades in arms in the early days as well.
Oh, mute. The mute button, Ian.
Here we go. Let me unmute myself. Yeah, no, a long time ago. I struggle to remember those days. So yeah, I'm Ian. I have a similar role to Bea here at Akamai for our media services in Europe. Yeah, it's interesting because before I came on here, I was starting to think about how long we've been kind of doing this thing, right? And then Dom sent that note out about 16, 17 years ago. Yeah, I mean it's interesting because if you kind of got to go back to those days, and sort of not a lot happened in the middle. And I guess in the last sort of 3-4 years, we've seen tremendous advancements in technology and acceptance of the use of streaming as a technology by the viewing market and so on. So yeah, back in the early days, it was really sort of Dom and I actually worked on quite an interesting proposition where we took some very low league sports rights, which which in those days hadn't been snapped up for linear distribution, and we were doing some quite interesting things. We were pushing some big boundaries in terms of live and on demand, but also in terms of sort of creating an online proposition and differentiating that from what was available in the linear world. So so in terms of fast forwarding to today, it's amazing to see how things are now almost on a month-by-month basis progressing. I look at the headlines. I don't believe all the headlines I see. There's a lot of FUD out there, to be perfectly honest. But if you kind of get underneath the data and you kind of get a better sense of what's going on, you see some really interesting topics, and one which kind of caught my eye, it kind of goes a little bit to FUD, is this sort of narrative which appears in the market, and there's lots of guilty parties doing this, which talks about the death of a linear industry, and hey presto, streaming is the magic answer. And it is interesting that we see this sort of, it's almost like dichotomy where you've got you've got the sort of streaming industry saying, I told you so, sort of 17 years ago we said this would happen, and now look, and there's all this sort of FUD in the market about death of linear. Reality is, linear is still a healthy proposition, right? It's got its challenges, but it's a very healthy proposition. I spotted a couple of analysts predicting that 2019 is going to be the death of linear advertising. We're going to see sort of terminal decline. And it kind of struck me, and I was thinking, well, interesting. If that was to actually happen, what would feed the ecosystem that creates this sort of huge wheel that we all basically work around? Bia was articulating quite neatly there the sort of differences between maybe the broadcast world and the streaming world. I actually bizarrely have spent a lot of time working in the broadcast world as well, and I generally don't see the difference in terms of the outcome. Obviously, there's a slightly different technology being used for delivery. There are some real possibilities that that new technology can bring. But fundamentally, what we're all about, whether it's linear or streaming or whatever, is distributing great content to viewers around the world. So I kind of, it's interesting. I sort of see this sort of narrative starting to appear. The press has got something to do with this, where they just desperately want this. It's almost like this this desire to kind of hurt our linear brethren. Don't hurt our linear brethren. They're doing a fantastic job. They're pushing boundaries as well. We're all collectively delivering a proposition to the viewing market, and I think my thing is really about getting some balance.
And it's interesting that you say that, Ian, because one of the articles that came out around the Super Bowl was, is this live TV's last stand? Something like the Super Bowl. And of course, it's great yellow journalism in terms of getting people to click through and read. Actually, there was an even better article that I passed to Dom and Eric, which was The Onion, which is the satire site here in the U.S., complaining that the sound system worked too well when Maroon 5 played the halftime show, that everybody was able to hear it clearly, which was absolutely horrible. But your point's well taken in the fact that we're ultimately both trying to get to the same, from a consumption standpoint, we're trying to get to the same point. What's your take on ATSC 3.0? I know that's a topic that I've been focused on writing articles. It's IP delivery multicast of live linear. Is that streaming, or is it just another way of broadcasting?
Yeah, so you mean simulcast, right? They're cousins across the water there. Yeah, no, it's interesting because one of the things which, you know, certainly we see a lot of narrative around in the market right now is around standards. Okay, so, you know, if I'm being honest, and we look at standards on the OTT side of the industry, you know, there's a few, annoyingly sometimes, but the you know, the consistency of standards through the value chain for both linear and online certainly does not exist. And I think anything that compels, you know, a more appropriate or a more consistent way of delivering live and on demand, yeah, all for it. So, you know, we're watching what DVB are up to, you know, HBB TV standards starting to creep through, which, you know, from a viewing perspective, anything that combines the power of linear, simulcast, catch-up, VOD through a single EPG with a consistent experience through the workflow, go for it.
So I think it's interesting. I historically was a big fan of standards. I think they are useful these days for getting critical mass for certain technologies, but they also can be constraining in terms of innovation when people sort of disappear off down a standard. I think, you know, HLS, despite all its success, has also had a certain limit to its capabilities, and because everybody jumped on the sessionless protocols, the fragmented, segmented technologies over the last few years, other problems such as latency have emerged because people became too adherent to one standard. I think establishing compute and network platforms which can be programmed by anybody in whatever standard they need is an underlying first principle. Then when you start to want to make services which get critical mass, I think it's useful to put a standard in there so that companies need unique IPR to be able to offer something unique to the market. Otherwise,
oh, sure. No, I agree. So, but I think there's, you know, if we go right through the value chain, right? So if you look at the cost structure for any organization looking to deliver simulcast as well as VOD and yada yada, it's horrendous. Mm-hmm. You know, it's truly horrendous, and I think there are elements of the value chain, and I've certainly seen, you know, a number of our customers think and start to call out for a need to think about, you know, whether it's at a UX level, you know, whether it's at a workflow level, you know, for elements of standardization to start to come in order to take cost out of the value chain. And from a vendor perspective or supplier perspective, you know, sometimes that's equally good. I totally take on board your point, though, Dom. You know, there's still a long way to go in terms of innovation in this market.
Ian, I would have to agree. It's sort of the economies of scale. If everybody can adhere to a standard, you bring cost of manufacturing the product down,
yeah,
etc.
Exactly. I mean, you know, if we look at the sort of, you know, the narrative in the market at the moment around you know, low latency, there's lots of different competing ways to deliver the same outcome. And I'm not suggesting that there should be a single way or a single adherence to doing it, but, you know, if we keep sort of reinventing consistently the tool, then yeah, again it really starts to sort of beg the question of is the online industry ever really going to be able to get to economy of scale? Because fundamentally, what drives the wheel that we all work in is the money. And if there's no profit, then why bother doing it?
And it's really this whole point about profit and scale and advertising, that really is the crux of where the industry is right now. Because today I was with one of our customers here in Spain, and they were giving me the grand tour of the currently linear facilities, which obviously they've been in the business for 20 plus years, so they have massive infrastructure. And then he showed me what they call their multimedia team, where they do all of the streaming and live and VOD services. And he was saying, ultimately, still today, where the money is for us is not there. We have to be there, but the advertisers right now, they're not yet that interested in working outside the linear world, which is what they've been used to doing. So it's an evolution, and I agree with you with all of the FUD that the media is creating around, linear TV is dead and so on, because ultimately I think what streaming has to be is just a tool to deliver the content. It's not a dichotomy where it's either this or that.
Yeah, exactly, and exactly right, Bia, and I think that's the context. So I think sometimes when we talk ad infinitum about the technology, what we miss is the fact that there's a viewing public out there, and fundamentally, they will take the decision as to what they watch and through which technology. They're not even making a conscious. Generally, if you ask an atypical viewer, they're not making a conscious decision about one particular technology versus another. What they're doing is they're finding kind of what they want to watch on a particular device at a point in time when it suits them. And if streaming delivers that, great. If linear does it, fine.
I think linear also has the advantage of a much higher profitability. We often talk about these growths in revenues in the online linear and the online distribution space, but obviously you've got scaling costs directly scaling with your revenues. Where in the broadcast and notionally IPTV multicast world, you do add audience and make more profit, which doesn't get accounted for so much. So I think the profitability of these ventures needs to be looked into as much as the revenue. So many of them are sinking venture capital that it's impossible to really work out the profitability at this stage.
And what's interesting, Dom, to Ian's point, is if you think about over-the-air broadcasting, and that's why I was mentioning ATSC 3.0, same thing with HBV TV, etc. Ultimately, you've got what you would receive over the air, but then you have the mobile providers in the middle if somebody wants to consume it on their mobile device that's going across the cellular data network. So it's not just a profitability model, it may be a profit sharing model as well, because once you hit, unless you're using something like EMBMS, once you hit the mobile network, it's all essentially going to be unicast again versus over-the-air multicast. So that fundamental problem to me is something that we have to solve. I think technically we can solve it, but whether the business model will allow it, I guess, especially from a mobile operator standpoint, remains to be seen.
So look, I've been dying to use my new slide. So let's fire in the tech slide because you started talking about EMBMS and technology things. So let's just fire this one in, which isn't going to make a noise because I'm talking at the same time. But Mark, you picked up on a story earlier, which was the Overwatch story. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? Because that was quite interesting. I think that might have some spawnings of some other topics with it.
Yeah, it's just a bit of an incremental development in terms of live streaming for entertainment and sports. The Blizzard Entertainment and the Overwatch League has advanced their deal with Twitch this year for this year's Overwatch League coverage and created what are they calling it? The All Access Pass, which enables users. I think it's $15. I don't know if that's a month or all in. I would imagine it's a month to be able to watch the Overwatch League and choose which player they want to follow, which is interesting. There's 10 to 12 players depending in a game, and to be able to watch an individual player through an entire tournament. And superimpose the maps of where that player is and where the goals are and that sort of thing on the player and that sort of thing. It's a much more customizable way to view that content. So it'll be interesting to see if other esports entities create kind of the same thing, or if this also kind of bridges over to other types of content other than esports, like live sports, for example.
Sounds like fantasystalker.com.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, we've already seen it in NASCAR to some degree, where viewers can select a particular driver and follow that driver's in-car camera throughout an entire race. So,
so this is a really interesting topic for us because you know, we serve, and I hate using the word traditional, but of course with new offerings such as esports, we have to find some sort of terminology for the non-esports offerings. So, you know, your traditional, or what we would have known as your standard sports, basketball, soccer, whatever it is. So many of our customers are telling us that they need to keep up with the offering that esport now brings in terms of interactivity, and how the user experience is so different when you're a consumer of esports. It's a lot more passive. And as you say, with NASCAR now offering that sort of perspective, others are trying to also catch up with that interactivity and that experience. And so we are looking at developing solutions that, as a viewer, you can be consuming your live stream of a particular event, and you can go back and you can choose camera angles, or you can look at highlights, but you are the one who's in control as a consumer. So it is very interesting to see how something like esports is coming in and reshuffling a little bit the way that we consume other sports too.
I'm going to pour a little bit of cynicism on the esports thing, and I think both our guests might have some comments on this. But I've been looking at sort of CDN architecture for gaming platforms over the last month or two. And it is interesting how gaming platforms are reporting things like concurrency. I've just been looking at this Fortnite game, and I was looking at some figures for Grand Theft Auto a little while ago. And concurrency for a gaming platform is much more akin to concurrency in people watching VOD than it is actually what we'd think about in terms of a live stream. Concurrency on a live stream is one thing going to many people, whereas actually in many of the games, not all games, but in many of the games, actually there's just hundreds and hundreds of spawned servers with about 30 people in playing each other, and actually it's very fragmented. So it's much more like a video on demand cached locally being streamed. So the distribution and the concentration of traffic in gaming is different to what one might expect. So when you see this article that's been going around the last week about Fortnite having 10 million concurrent players, they might have been all signed into a platform, but I doubt there was any centralized network concurrency in any one place. But Ian Bayer, you probably know better than I do. So I put that one out there just because I think metrics are metrics, and gaming metrics are even less regulated than streaming metrics at this stage. Therefore, a difficult currency for advertisers.
I mean, Bayer, I'll go on another hobby horse of mine. So metrics again is a big is a big one. You know, if you look at the way. So do you mind if I just take it away from esports? Just as easier to.
Oh, your guest lead.
just 2 seconds. So if you look at the way, for example, linear is actually counted in terms of viewers, and then the way effectively that the online industry counts concurrent viewers, they're two completely different things. And so I think one of the interesting things, we talked about standards, and we need to kind of come together a little bit. One of the interesting things is actually the industry starts to look at a common set of metrics, right, which actually means something. And I'm just going to throw this one out here again. Think about the guys who pay for a lot of this stuff, and it's the advertisers. So, if I was an advertising executive, I'd see figures like 10 million here, 20 million there, concurrent. I'd be a little bit bamboozled. Again, typically generated through FUD, but a little bit bamboozled as to what's going on. Because I then look at linear sort of figures, and they're figures which are generally understood, typically by advertisers. And I think one of the things that needs to happen is a combining, right, of a single source of truth. So, when I look at the article, I go, well, what do they mean by concurrent? Are they representing individual gamers? Is that a gamer on 2 or 3 different devices? What do they mean by that, right? So people will generally use terminology in a non-authentic way. And for me, data authenticity going forward is the lifeblood to what actually, bizarrely, any creative industry, right? So if you can't generate the right terminology, the right metrics, you can't see the value it's driving maybe to an advertiser. Therefore, it has no value.
Yeah,
I would argue that metrics in gaming would be inherently more accurate than metrics in streaming, in that you have the interactive component to it. If you're talking about someone who's playing the game, they're actually interacting with a server somewhere, so it's relatively easy to measure their stickiness, if you will, as opposed to a viewer who, like you said, may be watching the same stream on a couple different devices. It may be 100 people watching the same stream in a multicast environment behind a firewall or something like that. So there's a number of different ways you can throw off those numbers. Whereas, with something like Fortnite, if they're claiming that there are 10 million for the marshmallow thing, back in November it was 8.3 million. But that's all of those numbers are coming from Epic Games. They're not coming from an independently audited, source. So who knows how true they are, but if they are true, they're probably pretty accurate, just because you can count up the actual users.
Do we reach a point though, Mark? Kind of like with the Netflix thing of 45 million people watching whatever it was, Bird Box.
Right.
Do we reach a point where we suspect the companies themselves, because it's self-aggrandizing, it's self-beneficial for those companies? And how do advertisers reach a point where they would trust that were an accurate number?
Sure. I mean, well, the question is, does gaming ever become ad supported?
Certain Life was the attempt years ago, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and in certain sectors it is. I mean, for mobile gaming, obviously, but something like a platform like Fortnite, it's free to play, freemium model, and that's how they're making their money. I don't think that's ever going to be some sort of ad supported thing where they're going to need independently audited figures to sell ads, but it has to come to some sort of point of central honesty, or these numbers mean nothing. And as esports grows, and as gaming in general grows, I think we're going to it's going to be required that I mean, we're asking the same questions now that we were asking 15 years ago about live streaming, or 20 years ago with the Victoria's Secret and the this and that. Like, how accurate are these numbers? And now we have some independently audited numbers. We have we're aligning with the model of broadcast television. I think the same will happen for gaming eventually, but again, it's whereas live streaming and television, live content in general, and VOD content are all ad supported to a certain extent. Still, I don't think gaming is, and I don't think it will be moving forward.
Yeah, that's a good point. Sorry, Mark, I pulled us out of the gaming narrative here and went straight back into broadcast. Apologies, but I think there's a couple of things which do seem to be occurring. So if you look at the work that Barb, for example, are doing here in the UK, where they're starting to capture, they freely admit this themselves, they're not really quite there in terms of capturing all metrics, but they're making significant moves forward. So I think a common terminology that people respect, understand across the industry would be A, useful, and then B, seeing how the ratings boards or whomever that trusted independent set of voices actually come together and actually do something which we as an industry can understand, and advertisers can make value judgments on.
Well, and that's going to require SVOD platforms like Netflix to start sharing their data, which they're currently not doing. We had an article on Streaming Media last week about Barb talking about identifying or attempting to account for what they call unidentified viewing. 19% of all activity in 2018 was quote unquote unidentified viewing. What is it exactly? Barb doesn't know for sure, because someone's watching something on the screen, but they don't have access to what they're watching. And they're suspecting it's SVOD platforms like Amazon Prime Video and Netflix, but because Amazon and Prime and Netflix don't share that data, they can't be sure.
Well, and I think let's bring Bea in on this, because Uyala has done a pretty good job at sort of doing the state of the industry reports, and analytics has been part of the core of Uyala from the get-go. I guess, Bea, what's your take from an Uyala standpoint in terms of this honesty and accuracy, which seem to be two sort of intertwined pieces?
Correct. And I mean, it is clear that it is way easier today to get data that is more true than a few years back. What we do with our state of the industry reports that my colleague Jim O'Neill so wonderfully puts together 3-4 times a year is we actually look at data from our own customers. We collect, we are in the fortunate position, as I'm sure Ian is as well within Akamai, of having a lot of data points, which we of course protect very carefully. But it does give us give us a very good picture of how the industry is evolving. We've been doing this now for a good part of 10 years, and we are seeing patterns in consumption and devices, in regional patterns as well. And so to the point that Ian was making around, and Mark was making around standardizing, we are getting there, but we're a long way. You know, it would be good to have an industry authority that is able to collect this data and that everyone trusts. But I think we're in a very transitional point right now. We only collect the data points from our own clients. Of course, this is only a very partial picture of the industry.
And Nielsen, of course, has attempted, and a couple others, ComScore, etc. But it seems like it's either a trust issue with going back to the traditionals, a trust issue with some of the traditional broadcasters who don't feel like the online measurements are accurate. And maybe that goes to Eric's point with the Barb comment of, if you've got 18 to 20% that you don't know who it is, you know, does that sort of become phantom viewers, and how do you put the demographics in place on that as well? So.
I know Barb are looking, there are other organizations out there looking to solve this problem, but I know Barb are looking at putting some router metrics, whether that's a viable way of actually capturing the information. So there's innovation, and as Bea said, you know, it's that partial set of data points which you know, all organizations, including Akamai and others, you know, are able to catch, which doesn't give a complete picture. I think, you know, one of the lessons that you know, I've certainly learned is, because of, I mean, there's a lot of people who say to me things like, you know, extrapolating statistically what's happening in a group of households for a given nation. You know, that in itself is not a great way of doing it. I can't think of a better way, to be perfectly honest. But if you have a, you know, significant volume, you can then put reasonable errors of margin. When audiences get so low, and this applies to you know, any form of technology delivery. When audiences get so low, the statistical anomalies start to creep in. So I think there's a long way to go on this one, and I do hope we as an industry come up with a reasonable way forward. But anyway,
and just one probably last touch on this. One thing that we've seen with our state of the industry reports is that it varies incredibly from region to region. I mean, there are places like there's certain countries in Asia where mobile consumption has rocketed, and that doesn't represent necessarily what's going on in other geographies where, you know, in the UK, for example, linear consumption is still quite significant. So the data that we have is so partial. It doesn't really allow us to draw lines yet. I think it will, but it's very early days.
So let's actually talk real quick about the jobs market, because I think that was a topic that popped up just before, and I wasn't involved in that conversation, so it'll be new to me. Was it Ian? Were you talking about that prior to the show?
I think it might have been Dom, actually.
Yeah, Ben, Eric, and I were talking a little bit about the growth of the market overall, the incidence of more women appearing in the market, which is great, or maybe not appearing, but just emerging from wherever they've been. And there was a story this week about Apple going on a hiring spree. Let me just dig that out while I'm talking, which was talking where streaming careers are rapidly increasing. So have you guys been out looking for jobs recently? Is there anything out there? Is it growing? You've all gone very quiet.
Well, we're certainly seeing more and more companies come to our streaming, this is anecdotal, but more and more large companies are coming to our streaming media events with the express purpose of recruiting. And that goes for Apple, Hulu, Netflix, and other companies that aren't quite as large. So we've seen that trend over the last 2 or 3 years. Again, that's anecdotal, but I think I would hope that our shows are somewhat indicative of what's going on in the market.
And Eric, are they? Sorry, go ahead, Ben.
No, please do.
I was just going to ask Eric: are they there to specifically headhunt, or are they there to generally recruit?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay.
So one of the things that I'm seeing quite a bit in the circles that I move in terms of media companies, content creators, distributors, is that they are looking for that sort of talent. They are looking for people who have streaming skills, but they struggle to find the right people. There seems to be a need for the sort of talent that comes with knowledge and know-how about media creation, distribution in the kind of more traditional way, but now also understanding streaming technology. And I know we're going to talk about events in a little while, but recently I've been to a couple of events in the UK where the large broadcasters are saying that they are not only struggling to find diversity, whether that's gender diversity or any sort of diversity within the workplace in this industry, but also knowledgeable people with good streaming background, technical skills, as well as understanding what video media creation and distribution requires. So I think this is a great time to be in the job market. At least in the European countries, it seems that there are opportunities to go after. And it's good to see that Apple is going on a recruiting spree. Maybe I'll check it out.
I think they're going to all face a bit of a challenge in terms of trying to analyze at a point of recruitment who actually really understands streaming and who's pressed a few buttons on an application. And I think there's a big gulf of difference there.
Well, I mean, it's what's interesting is, and I know, I mean, this has been publicly voiced in a few forums actually, is that if you take it from let's look at a broadcaster. I think one of the things that they are now competing with is not only for talent amongst themselves, but talent with very large US tech companies, yada yada yada. So I think the pool of good talent, there's a lot of good talent out there, guys, right? I mean, there's a lot of exceptionally good young people coming through. We're seeing a lot of them. But the reality is that there are lots of organizations wanting them. So things get a little bit harder, and I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing, because if there's a demand, then like any good job market, if there is a demand, people will fill that demand, and they'll be rewarded handsomely for it. Good luck to them. I wish I was starting now as opposed to 18, 19 years ago.
So let's, given your age, Alan, and I'm not saying that in a negative way, and given what Bea said about the younger generation being more comfortable with streaming, etc., is this a young man's game, or is this something where they need the gray heads to be able to say, here's how we did it, here are the issues you're going to face as you come and try to recreate in an IP world what we did in a traditional over-the-air or cable world?
Do you know, it's funny because I mean, you know, one of the benefits of working for, like, you know, an organization like Akamai is, you know, I see a quite a diverse group of you know, young talented individuals coming through, great ideas, pushing the boundaries, and it's a joy to be around. Let me say that. But you know, do you need the gray heads? Yeah, I think you do, right? I mean, I also have had the privilege, you know, in my career of working with, you know, some individuals in the industry who, you know, literally handcrafted the original, you know, linear technology together, and their exacting standards, and I do mean exacting standards, have filtered through in almost every aspect of the way that certainly the broadcast and movie industry has kind of grown up. And you know, I think there's a lot that the IT industry can learn from them. Or certainly their legacy. Let me put it that way.
And it's interesting that you say that on the, you know, in the broadcast space and the exacting standards. I started in motion picture production, then I moved to video conferencing, then I moved to streaming. And in the video conferencing world, we had to learn things from the telecom guys like SS7, which was, you know, essentially predictive dialing, and then least cost routing. But when we moved to IP, there weren't equivalents on those. And so solutions like voice over IP solutions that, say, Celsius created and Cisco bought essentially ignored all those things, thinking they weren't relevant, and suddenly found they were highly relevant when we went to scale. And is that sort of your point, that when we go to scale, those exacting standards are critical?
Yeah, no, but I think it permeates as a culture, right? I mean, I think it permeates as a culture in every aspect, right? So, you know, there's a reason why linear works so well, okay? And I think, you know, there's a lot of talent coming through who will, let's put it bluntly, guys, who will literally drive this industry forward long after our days, or certainly my days, are over. I would like to see that permeation of culture, of exacting standards, remain in the industry, and I hope that sort of philosophy of viewer first remains. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but it remains in everything that we do going forward as a set of creative industries.
And I think that's very important to have that, not just historical background, but that exacting standards focus, because we need that to go to scale.
Yeah, exactly.
Speaking of scale, Mark, you had a topic that you wanted to talk about, which was essentially Disney Plus, and then I had a bit of an add-on to it. Captain Marvel's coming out here fairly soon, if I understand correctly. It will not be streamed on Netflix. It'll only be streamed on Disney Plus. What's the sort of master plan, Mark, especially since you do work with Marvel and some of the other properties that Disney owns?
I'm not sure if I can speak to the master plan from Marvel's perspective specifically. I think it's clear, you know, with this new information that we've gotten recently about what Disney Plus is going to be and how they're going to roll it out and what it's going to mean for their deals with other platforms like Netflix. You know, I think it's clear that for at least a while, they're going to take a hit on their revenues willingly to, in order to, you know, build their brand. Not that you would have to build Disney as a brand, but to build Disney Plus.
By hits, let's clarify, they're saying $150 million a year in Netflix licensing alone. And that's right, the size of many companies, but for Disney, not that big a deal.
True, and I think it'll be interesting to see, you know, who else are we talking about besides Netflix? Clearly, Netflix is probably their number one streaming platform, if you will, but there are other platforms on which Disney content is available, and it's not clear at this point as to how many of those will also be affected, or where they're going to draw the line in terms of audience, or where they're going to draw the line in terms of what qualifies as a competitive deal or not. So yeah, it should be interesting to see how that goes. I'm actually looking for that article right now, and I'm not finding it, but I thought I had it open here. But there's also the piece from Variety in the Flipboard talking about some of the same stuff, but also talking about it more from a technology perspective and the kind of investments that Disney is making in their infrastructure and their direct consumer offering. Did you happen to take a look at that?
I didn't actually take a look at it. I think Dom had. Dom, do you want to add anything into that specific piece from a technology standpoint for Disney Plus?
Muted on. I think it's going to be interesting to see whether they can maintain their SLA. I think the whole package. They're obviously very high profile. They're going to get some traction. I just worry that they're selling long tail content. I've said this before on SMAF. Oh, I'm not on camera, that they're actually a sort of form of long tail content more than they expect. That Disney is something that our generation and older are very fond of and very attached to, but that's actually a generation which see Netflix as their Disney and are very attached to that. And I think that there is. While Disney will without a doubt generate some significant revenues and put out some great content, they may find it not as plain sailing as I think they expect. I think that would be my.
And I would agree on that on one level, but I think Mark brought up in SMAF a couple months back that Disney has so much content from so many different properties, Star Wars, Marvel, etc., that it may drive people to see them as not a Netflix alternative, but certainly a sort of must-have. Now, for me, the pricing model is going to be a question. Could they cut a deal with Netflix to say, if you want Disney content, you'll get Disney Plus at a discounted rate if you also have Netflix? That would sort of be a deal with the devil, but to a certain extent, that may help drive a much higher viewership and potentially much higher revenue as well.
I agree. And when we had that conversation a few months ago, that was prior to the Fox deal taking shape. So there's even more content in their hopper than we had been talking about. And they're starting to roll out plans for Fox properties and some of the Discovery properties like Nat Geo and that sort of thing. So in addition to all of this Marvel, Lucas, Disney, heavy hitter stuff, there's going to be a ton of long tail stuff in there as well that I don't think they had before.
So do we sort of have a general sense that maybe Disney's odds are improving and getting traction in the industry because they have such a massive library at this point?
I thought their odds were pretty good to begin with. I think the question mark is really over companies like Warner Media. It'll be interesting to see how a company like Warner Media plays against a Netflix and a Disney Plus out there. There is another article in the Flipboard about the coming streaming wars. Yeah, who is it? It's newatlas.com. I don't know if you have that one handy, Dom, if you want to throw that up there, but they're talking about, you've got your Netflix and your Disney Plus, but you've also got like YouTube Red has original content. You've got HBO Go continuing to create and invest in original content. And so it's going to be interesting to see, how much of a bite of the market, because there is a finite number of dollars to be spent there. If I've got 6, 7, 8 different options of large, platforms in which to sink my cash for my Saturday night viewing, how many of those really am I realistically going to be investing in?
And this is the Spotify, Apple Music, iTunes, YouTube Music, Rhapsody, etc. problem that we've faced in
except none of those platforms have original content. They have original ways of consuming the content, like Spotify's curated playlists and things like that. And maybe one platform has a feature set that is more akin to the way you like to listen to music. But we're talking about original content here. I'm not going to pay for Netflix because it has a better UI. I'm going to pay for Netflix because it's got the 3 shows that I watch more than Disney Plus.
Yeah, although I think you could argue that there's exclusive content as well.
No, that must be 9 o'clock alarms because we must be.
Okay, Dom, I guess I've run out of time on this. So I'm going to throw it back to Eric. Eric, real quick. I mean, this is an interesting topic. I think as we go forward, we need to pay attention to Disney Plus to see if it's a model that is not quote unquote a Netflix killer, but certainly, puts it on the same level as Netflix. Eric, talk real quick about Streaming Forum, because I know that's coming up in Europe. We touched briefly on Mobile World Congress, but we didn't really talk about Streaming Forum. So to take us out, why don't you do that? And then Dom, will hand it on to you after that.
You bet. Streaming Forum is the 26th of February in London at the XL, co-located with BBE. We've got Florian Diedrichsen, CTO of DAZN. And it's funny, when Ian mentioned the dichotomy earlier, or the false dichotomy, I had to chuckle because in a recent interview with Streaming Media, Florian asserted that OTT will replace broadcast. And is that sowing a little bit of that FUD for their own purposes? Perhaps, but that's one of the things we'll be exploring at the event. We also have Deepa Cuddy from Sky giving another keynote. Dom will be moderating a great panel. Tim may or may not be there moderating, but check out streaming-forum.com if you haven't already, and hope you can join us in London.
Top stuff. Well, listen, I'd like to say a big thank you to our guests. Bear, are you still online? Are you there?
I am, for sure.
Or are you going to be over at Streaming Forum later in the month?
I'm planning to do so. So I'm just trying to work out how I'm going to do that together with Mobile World Congress, because, as I said, Women in Streaming Media is having a couple of events in Barcelona. So I need to work out my agenda, but for sure.
Cool, excellent. Well, we hope to see you there, and thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure having you on. And Ian, we have to say thank you to you as well. It's been good to catch up, actually. We haven't spent enough time recently, but thank you very much for joining us. Are you off to any conferences over later this month? Are you going to Streaming Forum?
No, Streaming Forum's the next one, yeah. Looking forward to it.
Excellent. Well, we'll have to have a little SMAF coffee somewhere. That would be good. Mark, Tim, you guys off to any events in the next week, few weeks?
Yeah, alas, I won't be at Streaming Forum, but we're already starting to gear up for NAB, so I'm sure we'll see you all there, followed by Streaming Media East very closely on its heels. So, yeah.
Perfect. Excellent.
And like I'm trying to figure out how to balance both Mobile World Congress and Streaming Forum. I know I'll be at Streaming Forum for certain, and hopefully at least a day at Mobile World Congress.
Cool. Excellent. Well, all of you, thank you very much for joining us. I will be next seen at Streaming Forum, moderating the panel on OTT and microservices and geeky stuff like that. So if you're passing, do pop by and say hello. And until then, we will be with guests Jeff Webb and Aubrey Russell on the first Thursday of March. So see you then. Thanks for tuning in.